So I think you could start anytime you wish. Yeah.
All right. So I'll start right now. Let me just share the screen and give you start with a bit of a recap because it's been a few days and maybe you don't remember everything. I just want to say that we more or less finished the quick overview of quantum physics, going back a century and a bit, and the main highlights of this quantum revolution in scientific thinking are the following: that prior to that, particles and waves were considered to be two different beasts, so to speak. But in quantum mechanics, an object is both a particle and a wave, and depending on what you're testing in terms of their behavior, you can see manifestations of particle-like behavior or a wave-like behavior, such as interference, diffraction. So electrons or neutrons can go through gratings just like waves would. So that's number one. Number two, some very exotic things occur in the quantum world. Things like the tunneling of particles through potential barriers which normally would be inaccessible to classical objects. So kind of imagine a ping pong ball going through a wall in your room, partial at least, a fraction of it would be in your room, a fraction would penetrate through the wall, so things of this nature. Then some of the more philosophically significant things like the inability to know everything about anything. In fact, complete knowledge of a single particle state is impossible due to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Then, of course, the introduction of the wave function by Schrödinger, description of physical objects in terms of waves, wave functions, rather, I should say, and superposition, which is completely bizarre. It's a bizarre world where a particle can be in two states at the same time. It could be up, it could be down, it could be here, it could be there simultaneously, and that leads to the famous Schrödinger cat paradox, and cat can be dead and alive at the same time. That's, of course, extending the analogy to microscopic objects, which we haven't talked about yet, and we don't really know if that's a real possibility. I just want to mention in this connection, which is kind of the limits of quantum mechanics are important to examine. And today, when we go into biology, we'll look at this. I spoke with a colleague of mine today from Institute of Nuclear Physics in Frascati, Italy. And last year, they published a kind of fundamental paper on measurements done under big mountains in Italy, isolating particles from for the influence of the environment and trying to find out if quantum effects are affected by gravity, gravitational forces, and they didn't find anything of this nature. So I probably mentioned to you that gravity is the one type of force which is not integrated into the rest of physics, quantum physics, that is. And they haven't found anything, but they haven't excluded. In other words, for particles up to the size of about 1,000 protons, there is no gravitational effect on the wave function. So that's kind of, but beyond that, we don't know. And one might think, by the same token, I think a group of physicists in Vienna, Austria, measured the wave function of a protein. So a very small protein, and that exists. Of course, it's much bigger than 1,000 hydrogen atoms, but the question is different. It's not if there is a quantum representation of a small protein, and they found one, but the question that was addressed in this experiment under the Gran Sasso mountain in Italian Alps is whether gravity can affect the wave function, and that's okay. So these are two different things. All right, so one more thing I want to add to the collection of bizarre quantum physics properties is the lack of commutability. It's a hard word to say. It means that the um, result of a measurement of two things depends on the order in which they are measured. In quantum mechanics, whether you measure position first and then velocity, or vice versa, velocity first and then position gives you a different outcome. In classical mechanics, that would not be the case. So that's one example where the order of measurements, the order of operations, we call them operations, operators in quantum physics, matters. And I think I will jump ahead because maybe in the last lecture I'll go back to this, but I want to alert you to this fact that I think this lack of commutatability is obvious in psychology. You know, psychological, let's say, if the order of two questions you can ask a person could be affecting the mood. You know, whether you start with a question about the state of happiness and something sad, second, or vice versa, will affect your state of mental well-being. You know, if you start with a happy question, then a sad question, then you will probably end up with a sad look on your face, and vice versa will be opposite. Anyway, and there are some actual serious scientific works adapting maybe metaphorically quantum ideas to psychology and psychiatry even. So that's and one more comment going back to the previous lecture, and I think I just have it here. So when people talk about quantum biology, and we'll be talking about it today, they quite often simply focus on these very small objects, elementary particles, and somehow dismiss this whole idea of biological systems being even possibly being in a quantum state because they are so big. But that kind of misses one important point, which I don't know if I highlighted enough last week, because there was kind of I ran out of time. But there are some other manifestations of quantum behavior. You know, we talked about energy levels, which are discrete as opposed to continuous. And by the way, without these discrete levels, we wouldn't have the spectra, molecular spectra, atomic spectra. All the spectroscopy is a manifestation of quantum nature of these systems. Okay, so that's super important. But even more important is the fact that you can have collections of many particles, in fact, an infinity of them. And so the size itself is not a barrier to quantization. And that is reflected in what's quantum statistics. And I mentioned very briefly that lattice vibrations of solids can be understood only when you introduce this quantization principle. That is, the waves that propagate through the solid, the disturbance of the atomic positions, these waves must fulfill the quantization condition. Without this, there wouldn't be the proper understanding of their global or macroscopic properties, such as thermodynamics, specific heat. And for this reason, I think I would kind of appeal to the biophysicists in the audience, if there are any, to sort of look for such manifestations in biological systems, such as those that were measured for crystals, you know, in the previous century. And if you look at a macroscopic crystal, you can put it in your hand, and you would be kind of surprised that this thing actually supports quantum phenomena, right? Because these vibrations that you don't see, you see a kind of static solid, but inside the solid, there's a lot of motion going on. The amplitudes of these motions are tiny, invisible to us, because they would be on the order of, let's say, an angstrom or so, which is the size of a hydrogen atom. But of course, we cannot see anything which is smaller than, let's say, a fraction of a millimeter. So So we don't see that. We think it's a static thing that is kind of solid and not dynamic at all. But in fact, if you look at it closely with better tools, then you recognize that there is actually quantization taking place. All right. So that's that. I just made some notes for myself to not to miss some of these important highlights. And that last example also leads to the concept of quasi-particles, not particles per se, like electrons and protons and neutrons and molecules later, but quasi-particles are actually collective motions of many particles. And you, instead of, let's say, focusing on a single object in this collection, you look at the collective dynamics of this. And one example would be, or metaphor for it would be, let's say, looking at a single soldier in a battalion or some division marching on a parade, rather than this entire block of soldiers marching lockstep. And this sort of collective behavior is what we call quasi-particle, or sometimes we call it collective motions. And one of this is the emergence of coherence. And coherence is actually a very important concept in biology, because that's one of the enigmas, actually, how organisms such as ours, or smaller single cells, or even as simple as E. coli bacterium, how they orchestrate all their motions so perfectly and without a conductor of this orchestra of molecules. So it's in my opinion still a bit of a scientific mystery to understand how, and we'll come back to it in a few minutes, because there are some compelling ideas in physics for this kind of thing, coherence or synchronization, if you will. It's a maybe more palatable word for biology, synchronization of different molecules and macromolecules and cells, and you build the hierarchy, and how is it all organized without this central command, so to speak. It actually goes up from the bottom to the top. All right, so you see here these quasi-particles I listed: phonons, magnons, polarons, excitons, polaritons. And these are collective behaviors of small particles, but in a large collection of the same objects. And some of them will be like phonons, would be lattice vibrations, magnons will be spin waves, and polarons would be polarization waves, excitons will be electrons excited to collective states and propagating these disturbances throughout the solid. So in physics, we do have such powerful concepts which have been measured and very well understood, whereas I think biology is still at the level of investigating individual or binary interactions, protein-protein interaction, protein DNA or protein ligand, rather than how does this whole thing behave together in a synchronous manner. And inroads are being made with systems biology, which is a new field, newish, maybe 20 years old now, systems biology, where you look at biological systems in terms of kind of engineering principles. But that's a separate lecture maybe on systems biology one day, if you allow me. That'll be the 5th installment to this saga. Okay, so we talked about bosons and fermions, two types of particles in physics, in quantum physics, those that like to be in the same state as other particles, bosons, social animals, I call them, and fermions would be selfish individuals who don't want to share the same place, the same state with other. And I mentioned quantum theory of solids. I'll go that's already something that I discussed last time. It's important because it's an example of a microscopic manifestation of a microscopic phenomenon. So macroscopic reflection of quantization, very, very important, through the propagation of these waves at low temperature. Okay, so something we'll come back to it actually on Thursday when we talk about metabolism, metabolic laws of metabolism, allometric scaling laws. So there are, yes, objections to going macroscopic with quantum effects, but actually not only is this unfounded, but there are counterexamples, actually galore, these superconductivity, superfluidity, lasers now so common in all the scanners and readers and pointers and whatnot. This is all based on quantization principle. And then I mentioned vibrations of crystals, phonons, and all of magnetism is a quantum phenomenon. Okay, now this is where I stopped. So how do we switch gears now and go into biology from all of this beautifully well-organized physics and simple by comparison? So I have to say that a lot of physicists have a bit of a contempt to biology because it's very descriptive and not mathematical enough. But I tend to disagree with this, and I tend to say that biology actually is a great challenge because it's so complex and it's so difficult to find underlying principles because of the diversity of organizational structures. So why would we even look for quantum mechanical phenomena in biology? Well, it would give us a lot of powerful ideas to implement, and I mentioned some of them from the bottom. Tunneling, for example, would allow and does allow for some low probability catalytic reactions to occur, because under classical conditions you would say, well, that reaction is impossible because it requires more energy than you have. But in quantum physics, it's not an obstacle. You can actually tunnel through states or barriers, and we call them potential barriers, even if you don't have enough energy. So this is low probability events become possible. And then, of course, we have the aspect of indeterminism, or otherwise called stochasticity, which means that this kind of agrees with our observations, I think, of everyday life, that the universe is not clockwork. There is a lot left to chance, and I think Simon de Laplace's a dictum about being able to predict the future of the universe is, of course, completely erroneous, and we can't even predict the future of a single particle, let alone the universe. Then we have currently a great amount of interest in quantum computing, quantum information, very powerful things in terms of how much information, so-called qubits instead of bits. Now we have quantum bits of information, can provide you with a huge amount of memory and also processing power with a small number of operating units. So that we are still exploring this very early stage of in quantum information science, but I'm sure great things will happen. And then I mentioned coherence, which kind of means synchronous behavior or in phase and in the same frequency. Now, entanglement is something which I think a lot of people studying biology, quantum biology.
I saw a TikTok and it said, how you look is your soul's idea of beauty. That's why everybody look different, because all of our souls are different. We said soul contracts, so like obviously they're not gonna get like that.
Sorry, what's going on? I don't know. Somebody's talking.
Yeah, I muted her.
Thank you. So I mentioned entanglement. So entanglement is a very weird thing in quantum physics, and many physicists kind of doubted that this is true, but there were definitive experiments performed by Alain Aspect in France in the late 80s, I believe, which demonstrated beyond the shadow of the doubt that you can prepare a system of two particles, for example, one electron with spin up and the other with spin down, and then let them go in opposite directions and sort of fly away. And if you measure the position of the spin of one at some point in time, the other particle will instantaneously know it or manifest its state as the opposite. So that means that they are coupled or entangled. They have the same wave function, irrespective of the physical distance between them. That is, of course, after controlled conditions. If you introduce noise and other interactions, that goes away. But nonetheless, that's what Albert Einstein called spooky action at a distance. That means that there is no physical interaction, but there is this entanglement. And that's a very interesting concept. If we could extend it to human mind, can we be entangled with other people? Can this explain some of the I hate to say paranormal, but strange phenomena that some of us may have experienced, right? Feeling some emotions when somebody is under stress, somebody close to you, far away, you have no physical interaction, but you know that something is going on. So anyway, entanglement is a very interesting property of quantum systems. And then, of course, without quantum mechanics, you wouldn't have electrons in atoms because they would have to fall on the nucleus due to electrostatic attraction, but they stay in orbits. So that's all right. Now, so that brings the question of where do we place all of this on the hierarchy of structures, and so here we have sort of at the bottom we go from the subatomic physics, quarks, making neutrons or protons. These make nuclei of atoms. Then you add electrons and you build atoms, and then you make molecules when some of the electrons are shared between atoms in a molecule, and then from these molecules you build small molecules. You build biomolecules such as proteins and enzymes and DNA, RNA. So sorry. So we are talking now about 1,000 atoms or more, on the order of thousands of atoms. So this is still within possibly the realm of quantum chemistry. So quantum effects at this level may, and we hope they do, exist. And there are some indications, as I mentioned to you in a couple of years ago, scientists from Austria demonstrated a small protein. I'm just blanking on the name of the protein which they demonstrated was in a quantum state, but it was about I'm thinking 1,000 10,000 Daltons, I think. But okay, so that's a smallish protein. But now we go into systems, so proteins and protein assemblies such as microtubules and actin and organelles, and the numbers of atoms grow exponentially. You go into the cell, which is 10 to the 10th. Can the cell be in a quantum state? We are in this sort of gray zone, mesoscale, which is a challenge for the scientific community today. But I'm thinking kind of in a slightly different way about it, namely that many of the so-called degrees of freedom can be completely classical, and some may be quantum. So in other words, maybe only some parts of these molecules can be in a quantum state, not the entire molecule. For example, we have such well-defined methods to deal with this in quantum chemistry, where, for example, you look at the receptors on proteins and ligands binding to these receptors. Ligands may be very small molecules, such as a drug molecule or a neurotransmitter molecule, relatively small, binding to a receptor. And this interaction itself can be modeled quite reasonably via quantum chemistry with electronic density distributions, that so-called orbitals, molecular orbitals. Whereas the rest of the protein, not the receptor, but everything that's outside of the receptor is classical. It's just bunches of atoms moving around under thermal vibrations. So this is what I call the mesoscale, where you kind of go into the territory between quantum and classical. And then the organism, okay, so we're not there yet. We typically use thermodynamics. So that brings the challenge of how you create hierarchies of systems, and biology is definitely an example of hierarchies. And if you go from one manifold, one hierarchy to the next, you just preserve only some of the main features, main characteristics. If you go from elementary particle physics to condensed matter physics, solids such as crystals and magnets and so on, the only thing that you need to know from elementary particle physics is the interactions between electrons and protons, and all the rest underneath this structure is invisible to you as a scientist. You don't need to know about the quark interactions by and large. Okay, and by the same token, if you go from physics to chemistry, most of the things that you care about is the nuclear degrees of freedom, and then the electron sharing or electron exchange or bond making, basically how you put atoms together to form a molecule through bonds. And then if you go from chemistry to biochemistry, then most of the chemistry is probably not too terribly useful for biochemists, but what you need to know is nucleic acids and amino acids, and how you create peptides and polymers of DNA and RNA and some other biomolecules. So at every level, if you go up higher, you lose focus and make it a bit more approximate. So the concept here is that actually the most fundamental laws of physics that apply to elementary particle physics are maybe not needed for condensed matter physics, and in chemistry even less so, and so on. So this is now I'll go through 3 scales of biological systems to kind of understand where we are at in terms of dimensions, physical dimensions, the time scales, and the energy dimensions. Especially energy is important, but also the scale of distances. So the electron orbital is about, so we start from physics, go into chemistry, 10 to the minus 11 or 0.1 angstrom, a covalent bond, which is the strong bond that makes the scaffolds of most of the biomolecules, is 1 angstrom, on the order of 1 angstrom, maybe 1.5. Hydrogen bonds, which are the weak ones that readjust and are made and broken all the time, are about 3.5 angstroms in distance. So these are the smallest distances from which we can build the biological world, so to speak. And then when you look at the dimensions of biomolecules, the DNA, the width is about 2 nanometers. Of course, it can stretch for kilometers if you were to straighten it out, but it's folded, so it fits neatly into the nucleus. Nucleus would be several micrometers in dimensions. Ribosomes are about 20 by 30 nanometers. Viruses are the smallest entities, I would say, autonomous entities. They are not really alive unless they are in the host. So that's the gray zone between life and inanimate matter. Virus is about 100 nanometers, now in the spotlight very much because of COVID. So actually, this is a coronavirus here. I didn't notice it before, but this is pre-COVID. Slide is pre-COVID, but we have a virus illustrated with a coronavirus example. So 100 nanometers, very small, but the smallest autonomously living systems are E. coli bacteria, about 1 to 2 microns in diameter. And then we go into red blood cells, 2 to 5 microns, and larger structures. And with this, you have to keep in mind the tools with which we can observe these things. We can't go in too much detail in real time, but we have electron microscopy and X-ray crystallography, and now we have STM and TEM, but still very limited observational capabilities, and the resolution. Well, with X-rays, actually, we can have a resolution down to 1 angstrom, X-ray crystallography. But this requires some very artificial sort of manipulations of structures into protein crystals and so on. So now the time scales, and this is a much more challenging aspect for physicists, because here the time scales span how many? 24 orders of magnitude. Well, actually even more, because actually this is cut off on the left-hand side. We should actually back up to 10 to the minus 12, which would be picoseconds for molecular motions, nanoseconds maybe for some conformational motions of larger scale, and then chemical bond, you see here, chemical bond vibrations, even sub-picosecond. And then the fusion processes, cell signaling on the sort of between a microsecond to a millisecond, and our sort of cognitive responses on the order of, and this is tough, but I would say 100 milliseconds minimum, right? Maybe in some cases faster, but I think the threshold for perception is about, I don't remember, 200 or 300 milliseconds. In other words, you can't perceive something which is shorter duration than, let's say, 100 milliseconds. On the other hand, how do hockey players see the puck going so fast, and they can actually have a reaction to it? That defies these kinds of algorithmic approaches to human behavior. I think it's something else. Some of it is trained, of course. And then you have cell division taking place on the order of hours to several hours, maybe 2 days, and so on. So, and then, of course, life on Earth, about 4 billion years. Okay, so that's the time scale challenge. And then we go into the energies, which is kind of interesting. And we have an energy bottom, which is clear, and below that, I would say, things become irrelevant to biology, namely KT. This is thermal energy. K is the Boltzmann constant. T is the absolute temperature of approximately 310 Kelvin, which is 37 degrees Celsius, our body temperature. So anything which has energy less than that, which translates into the biochemical units of 0.6 kilocalories per mole. If you think in terms of physical units such as electron volts, that is 25 milli-electron volts. In other words, a single charge molecule in the presence of 25 millivolt potential experience this kind of energy. So if it's only 25 millivolts, thermal vibrations will destroy that electrostatic attraction, for example. Okay, will be comparable to it. Okay, so that's the bottom of the energy scale in biology. But there is also, I would say the top, but there is very important energy scales for covalent bonds would be kind of the most, the strongest, 90 kilocalories per mole. So thermally, you can't break it by unless you fry the whole thing, but not at physiological temperature. They will not be spontaneously broken by anything. On the other hand, hydrogen bonds can be anywhere from 0.5 to 12 kilocalories per mole. So weak bonds can be spontaneously disrupted by thermal energy. And most importantly, at the bottom, you see in red, biological energy quanta. What is that? Well, biological energy, by and large, is created by oxidative phosphorylation involving mitochondria. Not only, of course, there's also glycolysis. We'll talk about it later. But by and large, and most of the stored energy can be kept in the form of the energy currency, which is ATP molecules, adenosine triphosphate or guanosine triphosphate, GTP. ATP is more common, and this is kind of biological energy quantization because it comes in discrete units. You cannot have 1/2 ATP or 1/2 GTP. You can have only one unit. And in fact, many of the processes, for example, in active transport across membranes, or in terms of motor protein processivity, many of these processes require 1 unit of biological energy per step. So if you look at the kinesin motor working on microtubules, each step of one of its heads costs 1 molecule of ATP to make. So it's not diffusion, it's definitely directional movement, which is at a cost. And that cost is somewhere between 3 kilocalories per mole to 60, depending on concentrations. ATP is more expensive than GTP. So somebody came up with an idea to call it a biological energy quantum, and approximately it's 10 to the minus 20th joules. So in physical units, but definitely several, at least 5 times above kT. So it cannot be spontaneously reversed by thermal fluctuations if you use this kind of thing. All right, so now it's a long list of complaints against quantum biology by critics and naysayers who kind of doubted it, and so these are some of the main criticisms against this this concept, because living systems are big, cells are big compared to electrons and protons and these elementary particles. But I told you this is a fallacy, because quantum physics exists or applies, I should say, to larger systems, even macroscopic systems. So that's a complete nonsense to say that cells are too big to be quantum. They say life is hot. In other words, most of the quantum processes become classical when you go to room temperature or even below, such as superconductivity, which is a quantum process. I mentioned macroscopic quantum process, but I haven't followed the trends in high temperature superconductivity. They call it high temperature, but it's the latest I remember was something like 110, maybe 20 Kelvin, which would be minus 200 and minus 150 degrees Celsius. So it's not really warm or high temperature, but nonetheless, there are examples of quantum processes in room temperature as well. So that's not really that much of an argument, although I agree that thermal decoherence is one of the problems that has been highlighted by the critics, that quantum effects become washed away by thermal noise. And that's why I brought this KT unit to the picture on the previous slide. And then also life processes are slow. That's true. As I mentioned to you, most of the life processes, such as cell division, is super slow, on the order of hours. And movement of cells is slow. compared to quantum events, which are on, let's say, picosecond or even femtosecond, so 10 to the minus 15th or minus 12th. Now, but this may not be a problem either, because nanoseconds or nanoseconds and nanometers, nanotechnology, nanoworld right now is where a lot of action is in science, and it's kind of a bridge between macro and micro, and a lot of living systems are, it's not are, but their building blocks are in the nanobiotech area, which is, you know, again, nanometers, nanoseconds. So we are kind of bridging the gap here. I wouldn't say that we know exactly how we go from nanoseconds to milliseconds, where, let's say, physiological reactions occur, but let's leave it there. And then complexity. Well, complexity is only in the eye of the beholder. So I think because we don't know how to deal with 30,000 proteins inside the membrane with you know, many thousands of phospholipid molecules surrounding it, and there is water and ions and all of this. We simply don't have the ability yet to understand the complexity of a living system, of a living cell, even not a whole system. And then there is the question of life not being fuzzy. Okay, these are, I wouldn't say serious scientific arguments against it. It's just that we are psychologically used to having yes or no answers rather than probabilistic, which I stressed last time. Quantum mechanics requires probabilities rather than certainties. Okay, so at the bottom of all of this, I make a comment that with all of this being said, we have only been using quantum mechanics for about 100 years as a human race, and Mother Nature has been performing parallel experiments for about 4 billion years on billions and billions of examples and experimenting and retaining the best. So there is evolutionary advantage being retained. So while we feel this is maybe an overwhelming challenge, it's really early. We are early in this game. There are still many unsolved problems in molecular biology, which, as I said, quantum physics could help resolve. And the most important thing is collective dynamics, which in biology typically is kind of ignored, and that we should look at correlations between movements of molecules and whether you know, pattern recognition, and as well as a molecular recognition, long-range interactions. All of these things are the domain of physics and would help understand how biological systems work in total, as a whole, rather than, yeah, we understand that this protein, when mutated, you know, p53, triggers a cascade of things which result in the cell not being able to repair damage, and, you know, so on and so forth. So most of the biological thinking is actually kind of linear, but not non-linear and not global in terms of the entire system. I'm not criticizing it. I'm just saying that the way it is, it takes time to see everything, every aspect, and integrate it into a complete theory. Okay, so self-organization is another aspect of biology, which is quite intriguing and calls for kind of a new biology, I guess, you know, from the mathematical descriptive point of view. But one thing that I want to stress here, and there's a lot of words on this slide, one thing that I want to stress in terms of differences between living systems, organisms, and physical systems that most of the time we study, is that living systems are open. They cannot be closed. And if you took physics courses, quite often, like in thermodynamics, you consider a system which is isolated from the environment, and you kind of create an idealized, abstract representation of the system. But living systems cannot be thought of as closed, because they would not be alive. To be alive, you need to exchange matter with the environment. You have to bring in nutrients and excrete waste material, and you have to provide oxygen and expel carbon dioxide and so on. So open is a technical term in physics. And the second is, there's one S missing, should be dissipative. Dissipative means that they actually dissipate energy in the form of heat, because they must maintain, most of them anyway, constant temperature. Yeah, irreversible means that this is not a system that can be moved from state to state and back again without any loss of, well, we call it information or gain of entropy. That's a kind of a separate topic again. I don't want to get too much, but I hope you get the picture that there is a somewhat fundamental difference, and this is what Erwin Schrödinger kind of obsessed about in this little booklet called What is Life in 1943 or 1944. So quantum mechanics, yeah, kind of in a single slide. Of course, now we go into quantum computers, which are bringing us into the quantum age of information technology, and living systems are information processing system, because they respond to stimuli and process these bits of information coming from the environment, whether it be it's too cold, it's too hot, or there is food there, or there is a possibility of mating somewhere else, or it's toxic, you know, we have to move away, so fight or flight. So information processing is by definition part of the organizational setup of living systems. They process information all the time, whether it's quantum processing. It might as well be. This may be actually one of the aspects of quantum biology, which is not well understood yet. But if living systems were to perfect one aspect, which is basically their survival depends on the avoidance of predators, and that has to be quick. If you're too slow, then you'll be eaten alive. And so quantum principles allow you to process information incredibly rapidly, because the wave function spreads to all the systems outer reaches. It's not algorithmic in a sort of linear way, like in classical information processing, you go, you know, step by step. In quantum, it's simultaneous. Okay, so now what is the definition of quantum biology? Because I've been talking about it now for 1.5, almost 2.5 hours in both lectures, but I haven't defined it yet. And in Wikipedia, we'll find that the quantum biology actually, in this sort of currently accepted framework, refers to some of them, just seeking some of these most exotic aspects of quantum physics in biology. So actually I would call it quantum physics in biology, not quantum biology. And I'll explain later on what I would mean by quantum biology. But here, what's generally accepted is that things like trying to find a wave function of a biological system, let's say superposition or entanglement between biological systems or parts of a biological system. So non-locality means this aspect of entanglement, which is non-local. That is, two quantum objects can be connected by a joint wave function through vast amount of space with no force involved, right? No physical force, just quantum entanglement. And then tunneling. Tunneling is probably the least controversial of it all, because we see it in some catalytic chemical reactions for small molecules. And that's where actual quantum mechanics, molecular mechanics has been used a lot, as opposed to other things. And so this definition of quantum biology is in contrast to what one would say obvious quantum effects in biology, which is quantum chemistry, because all bonds are basically quantum, especially covalent, where you have a electronic wave function shared by two atoms in a covalent bond. So anything that it has to do with this is by definition quantum, but that's not what people, this would be like a trivial example of quantum mechanics that work in biological systems. Every covalent bond is a quantum bond, and many others as well. But anyway, that's not, so these weird effects is what people are looking for. And so what do we have so far to show for, in about, what is it, about 15 years or so of kind of a quantum biology era that started with not even 15, maybe something like that, less than 20 anyway. We'll go through this list. Physiological quantum effects. So the human eye, actually, the rods and cones in the retina operate on the quantum principle, because they can detect a single quantum of electromagnetic radiation, a single photon in the visible range, and transfer this. They are very precise photo detectors. They not only perceive it, but pass on this information in terms of the electronic signals that are transduced and sent by the optic nerve to the brain. And then, so that's number one. Number two is the sense of olfaction or smell, the sense of smell in humans, but even more so in some animals. Dogs, the dogs which are used for by the police or border guards looking for contraband or things of this nature. They can detect a single molecule of a substance for which these dogs are trained, and we can also have a very acute sense of smell. And the fact that a single molecule is detected doesn't mean it's quantum, but there is a theory that I'll come back to a bit later on, which shows that olfaction works not on the principle of steric fit, but on the principle of resonance. So it's a quantum resonant interaction between the molecules, vibrational degrees of freedom, and the receptors, vibrational degrees of freedom. So that's a resonant interaction, not a shape matching type of interaction. And the reason for it is that various aromatic molecules, which we detect as giving us the sense of smell, whether it's perfumes or some odors, they have really nothing in common shape-wise, but they have a lot of things in common in terms of vibrations. Then the next effect, which is on the list, is migratory bird navigation. This is quite an amazing. These migratory birds, such as European robins or some of the birds that we see in Alberta, migrating to the south in California or Mexico in the fall and coming back in the spring. They detect minute deflections from the magnetic field direction, and that's how they navigate. And the amount of energy that this difference in the magnetic field orientation requires is so tiny that it has to be a quantum effect. It cannot be done. And of course, they don't have a compass or a GPS, but they have and we'll very briefly look at this. They have a molecular mechanism which involves electronic transitions of spins. So that's been one of the main effects talked about in the area of quantum biology. And the most important one is photosynthesis, which is the as you all know, photosynthesis is the way plants and some bacteria, some algae harness energy from sunlight, and that involves capturing photons and then generating electronic transitions that then can be collected in specific areas, molecular receptor sites, and that energy is then used to make glucose with water and CO2 as additional ingredients. And then mitochondrial metabolism. In mitochondria, there are, in mitochondrial walls, in fact, there are 5 complexes, protein complexes, which involve electronic tunneling, in fact. So a quantum process which is required in this whole electron transfer chain, which is coupled to proton pumps and proton transitions. I'll spend more time on this very topic on Thursday, because it's very important. I think before I move on to the last two, I want to stress something here, which is, in my opinion, central to this whole concept of quantum biology, because photosynthesis and mitochondrial metabolism are not just two of several phenomena that are quantum in nature. They are the quintessential defining phenomena for living systems, namely energy transduction, either for plants and some bacteria, as I mentioned, from light, and that's at the core of its existence, of the existence of these biological systems, plants. And the same can be said about mitochondrial metabolism, which is at the core of the existence of eukaryotic cells in animals and humans. So this, without this energy, there is no life. And the fact that the energetic processes are utilizing quantum mechanics for their efficiency, incredible efficiency in energy capturing and transduction, that's really something very important. And of course, all of the energy on this planet comes from the sun, either directly or indirectly, directly to the plants that harness it, and then of course animals use it for as their food, and we use animals and plants as our food. So it's the food chain that starts with the energy from the sun. So even if only photosynthesis was quantum, that's already the most pivotal link in this food chain. All right, and then the last two are kind of with question marks. Actually, 3. So anesthesia, the procedure that allows us to do surgery and avoid pain during surgery, basically turns off consciousness of the patient, and that is by some postulated and argued it has a quantum effect. I'll talk about it a little bit again on Thursday probably, and then consciousness itself. So you may have heard about or read some of the books by Sir Roger Penrose, He's a professor of emeritus of mathematics at the University of Oxford and the Nobel Prize winner in physics from 2020. A year ago, he got the Nobel Prize, not for this, but he proposed well, he wrote two famous books, Shadows of the Mind and the Emperor's New Clothes. I think it's the Emperor's New Mind, maybe. It's a variation on this phrase. Anyway, you can look it up. Popular books where he argued that cognitive processes, many of the cognitive processes cannot be explained by classical physics at all, because they kind of defy algorithmic interpretation. They require something like quantum processes. So he argues that our mind is actually, to a large degree, operating in the quantum level because of some of these exotic properties of quantum physics. This would sort of fit the bill. But these are amazing books. I highly recommend that you read them if you have the time, and they require a lot of intellectual heavy lifting, I think, to understand much of the content, but it's quite fantastic. And the last one is, so some of the challenges in protein folding, that were posed by people who tried to simulate them by computers and understand the time it takes for the protein to fold from a peptide chain to a globule, which is very, very short. Actually, in experiments, it could be, let's say, microseconds or milliseconds for the protein to fold. But if you want to simulate this on the computer, that would take the age of the universe or something like this, because there are so many potential steps. Yeah, you need to make all the possible transitions between orientations of each amino acid with respect to the next. So if you were to explore all these possibilities and give each possibility, let's say, a very short amount of time to do, you end up still with astronomical numbers of choices to make on the way, and each choice to be explored adds up to a huge amount of time. Now, so however, if you had a quantum search algorithm or a quantum process, you explore all of this at once, more or less, and that would explain why protein folding could be a quantum process. The same with gene mutation. There were some theories proposed that mutations of genes occur as a tunneling process, not a kind of classically mechanical, replacement of one nucleic acid with another by random choices, but it's more of a quantum transition. All right. So quantum biology. I mean, this I told you that the field is only about 15 years old, but people, physicists, many famous physicists talked about biology as an area where quantum physics would be very powerfully implemented. And this includes those famous names: Niels Bohr, Werner Heisenberg, Erwin Schrödinger, John von Neumann, Carl von Weizsäcker, Althusser, Weishaupt, Wigner, Dyson, Kessler, and others. So they all said that quantum mechanics is essential for understanding life. And as I argued a minute ago, I mean, the metabolic aspects of living systems are sufficient to warrant this kind of statement. Yeah. As you can see here in Wikipedia, there's also a kind of contrarian the description of quantum biology as a speculative interdisciplinary field that links quantum physics and the life sciences. It's true. I would say speculative is less and less so as we see more and more examples. I've listed a few, maybe half a dozen or so, but you could say the same thing about quantum physics 100 years ago, where there's only a few examples at that time. And now, of course, there's everything around us can be seen through the quantum physics lens, including being able to understand the composition of distant galaxies. So in addition to those that I mentioned, there are some other ones like biophotons. So it's a field of biophotonics, ultra weak emission of photons from living systems, including plants, including dividing cells. They emit ultraviolet electromagnetic waves measured, and so photons are quanta of electromagnetic radiation. Therefore, I don't know if this would be a trivial quantum biology example or non-trivial, but definitely quantum. Light harvesting. So there are some thin films which are simpler than photosynthetic systems, and they also allow you to collect the energy from light in terms of electronic excitations, and then funnel those into the collection centers, and then basically gather all that energy in specific places for use, whether it be chemical synthesis or things like that. And then there is Alexander Davidov was a quantum physicist in Kiev, Ukraine, and he proposed a theory in late 80s, I believe, or 70s and 80s, that in fact was supposed to solve the problem of efficient energy transfer in biological systems through alpha helices and in proteins and peptides and DNA, which involved quantum phenomena, but more complex, namely excitation, electronic excitations in specific groups, and amide bonds, in fact, and then coupled to vibrational degrees of freedom, which then formed a localized distortion of the structure, which could propagate through it and carry this mechanical energy from point A to point B along a chain such as DNA or a peptide chain. There have been a lot of efforts to demonstrate experimentally its existence. Very little has been achieved in this direction, but the theory is quite interesting. And then Frolich, Herbert Frolich was another famous physicist who tried to come up with a theory of coherence in biological systems. I'll actually talk about this a bit more on one of the next slides, because it's quite important, in my opinion. It really allows to seek explanation for coherent behavior in biological systems, which is still very difficult to explain. And this is long range and long range coherence. And there is some other work which talks about coherence in cellular water. These are kind of peripheral topics I will not spend time on. Let's see if I can advance. Okay. All right, this is an empty slide here for some reason. Okay, so we do have these two solid examples of quantum biology at work, and energy transport in synthetic complexes called FMO. So these are the early papers of what we now call quantum biology and magnetoreception in migratory birds like European robins. So I think they go earliest 2004, so it's now 17 years or so. But most of the photosynthetic work goes back to 2007, 8, and so on. So around 15 years or so. So that's a slide which kind of explains how this compass works in the retina of the bird's eye. It has some specific proteins, cryptochromes, which have 2 electron spins coupled and coupled to the nuclear spin, and nuclear spin responds to the direction of the magnetic field, and small difference in direction through this coupling makes a transition between the collective spin of the 2 electrons, and it can be in a so-called singlet state or a triplet state. A singlet state is when you have one spin up and the other spin down, adding up to 0, spin 0. That's why there's only a single manifestation of this. And a triplet state is when they add up to spin 1. So that 3 states, which 3 projections of spin 1, +1, -1, or 0. And this transition has an energy difference, slight energy difference between these 2 states, which can be triggered and then result in a electronic transformation that can propagate and through the bird's molecular photoreception system, and then so it basically the eye would steer the bird in a direction along the magnetic field line as it accidentally moves away from it. So it's a little bit complicated, but apparently it explains very well to a very high degree of accuracy this phenomenon, and it's quite amazing how accurate the bird's perception of orientation in space is. It kind of matches our best equipment, electronic equipment that we have to detect tiny variations in the direction along the magnetic field lines. And this is the concept that explains the olfaction, the phenomenon of olfaction. There are 2 kind of competing theories. One is the shape matching, and the other is vibrational theory of odor specificity. So the shape matching doesn't really, it has a lot of holes, because as I mentioned to you, the aromatic molecules have so many different shapes, and the receptors are not flexible enough to adjust to these shapes. However, the vibrational theory, which was proposed by Luca Turin and collaborators. Luca Turin is a scientist who spent, I guess, 20 years of his career in the cosmetics industry, designing perfumes and so on. And he came up with this theory that it's not shape fitting, but it's actually vibrational resonance between the molecule of the aromatic substance and the receptor in our olfactory nerves. Okay, so that's that. Where are we on time? Okay, I have a few minutes left. And another interesting concept which is related to biophotons is the concept of morphogenetic fields. We kind of we got really impressed with genetics, with the DNA and the genetic code. I'm fascinated by this myself, but in essence, the genetic code gives us information only about the instructions how to make a protein or how to make all proteins in our body, but doesn't give us any instructions about how to make morphology of cells or morphology of organs or morphology of tissues. And this gentleman, Russian scientist, Alexander Gurevich, introduced into biology the idea of morphogenetic fields, which basically would explain why systems such as cells and organs and tissues and in fact the whole human body eventually attain a particular morphological shape. So that's yeah, he wrote these papers in 1912. Actually, the concept of morphogenetic fields in some form, shape, or form still exists. Some people like Rupert Sheldrake who promote this, and I think it's a bit so because it's a field. So that's brings it to the realm of quantum ideas. Although I don't think there is any definitive demonstration of this being true or not. I find it very intriguing, to be quite honest, because there is no good explanation of on the form attainment of form. There is quite a bit of work in this direction that took place in the 70s and 80s, and you have here on the right Ilya Prigozhin, a Belgian, Russian actually by birth, but Belgian by the country in which he worked, scientist, chemist. Ilya Prigozhin developed this theory of reaction or dissipative structures, reaction diffusion equations, which lead to pattern formation. So this is not really quantum, but it's very interesting, nonlinear theory of interacting species. And that kind of spawned the whole area of science called mathematical biology. We have actually Mark Lewis in the Department of Mathematical Sciences at the U of A, who is one of those very famous mathematical biologists who use similar approaches like that Ilya Prigozhin introduced, using coupled differential equations to describe the formation of patterns in living systems, not only biological but also sociological, or even it applies to environment, to invasion of species into the environment. Ilya Prigozhin got a Nobel Prize, by the way, in chemistry for his work, because it was fundamental, showing how chemical reactions, which you normally associate with kind of diffusion and uniformization of products of chemical reactions, he showed that many reactions lead to very complex patterns being formed, spatial patterns. One of which is called one of these systems is called the Brusselator, because he lived in Brussels, so it's Brusselator. You can look it up. Yeah, he was at the Free University. It's Université Libre de Bruxelles. Anyway, that's yeah, Nobel Prize in Chemistry 1977. So yeah, that's why is this important? Because we mentioned negative entropy. When you have a pattern forming spontaneously from a reaction, that means that you reduce the entropy. The entropy goes down when you see patterns, and that's where biology goes, by reduction of entropy and creation of information. All right, so, and here's Herbert Frolich I mentioned. Maybe I'll end this lecture with just a few words about Frolich theory, which is still very intriguing to me. It was quite famous in the late 1980s. Herbert Frolich, actually, I never met him, but I was about to meet him in 1991. At a conference on NATO, believe it or not, NATO organized a conference on what is life. You don't see the irony in it, I see.
Yeah.
And Herbert Frolich was one of the invited speakers to the conference that was in January 1991. Kim, the audience probably doesn't remember that period, but you must remember the first Gulf War.
Sure. No, I had funding from NATO around the time that I came here as chair. So NATO was supporting a lot of really valuable
They had a very
science.
robust program of scientific support. I got some grants as well, but it stopped, I think, a few years after that.
Yes.
So anyway, Herbert Frolich was invited, and unfortunately, he actually died during that conference and never made it to Tucson, Arizona, which was the place of the conference. But so here's basically a summary of this theory, Frolich theory of long-range coherence in living systems, and it's a quantum theory. So it assumes a lot of words here. I'll just explain very briefly what it means. He assumed that there are oscillating dipoles. There's a lot of dipole moments, electrical dipoles, and especially in the heads of phospholipid molecules in the membrane. It's a very regular array of these head groups. The dipoles are oscillating, interacting as they oscillate, and that's fine, nothing special about it. But then you have to pump this with energy, like electric field energy, which creates a metastable ordered state. And so the theory is based on three ingredients: the pumping of metabolic energy above a certain critical threshold, the inclusion of thermal noise, which is always there in biological systems, and nonlinear interactions between these dipole degrees of freedom. And that leads, so it's a very mathematical theory, very actually elegant if you study the papers, which leads to again, collective dynamic. Remember, I emphasized the crystal structures and the phonon modes, which propagate in a quantum. This is dipole modes in a membrane, which are supposed to be leading to a collective giant dipole oscillation, which would explain recognition between cells, for example, cell-cell interactions, which I'll come back to on Thursday. There's still something, and explain why it is so important in this context. And he predicted these oscillations to be in the terahertz range, 10 to the 12th, between 10 to the 11th and 10 to the 12th. Now, again, there was a lot of experimental fervor trying to demonstrate it. Some people believe that they did. I don't think there's a lot of irrefutable evidence. There are some kind of, some papers which seem showing some of that. But what struck me recently when I thought about this theory again, that to my knowledge, nobody has actually looked at neurons where you actually have this natural pumping of energy through action potentials, which travel, ionic waves travel through the membrane of the neuron, axonal membrane, and the dipoles will be excited. And that would satisfy the Frolich assumptions of this theory. But to my knowledge, people were not, scientists at the time were not really studying neurons. They were studying things like cancer cells, trying to find differences in these inherent oscillations in cancer cells compared to normal cells. So the bottom line is this was a proposal, if you will, using quantum principles applied to biological membranes and resulting in a Bose-Einstein condensate. So it's a collective quantum state, kind of macroscopic because the entire cell would be supporting the state, and the cells could aggregate. And actually, I participated in one project that tried to demonstrate that this is correct for the formation of rouleau. Red blood cells form rouleau. It's called rouleau formation. I don't know if Kim, if you're familiar. Yeah, and we studied experimentally the rate of aggregation of these red blood cells into rouleau, and tried to explain this using this theory. And we ended up with inconclusive evidence, because it could be explained this way, but it could also be explained in a sort of completely classical static dipole interaction between red blood cells. So anyway, that's where we are at, and that's now many years later. Frolich is unfortunately not with us anymore for a long time, 3 decades. And this beautiful theory needs to be verified somehow. But I'll stop at this point because I used up my time and leave some time for questions. Thank you.
Okay, if you'd like to stop sharing, then we can show the
Sorry.
slides. Yeah, all right, so let's see. Yeah, wow. All right, any questions? And I'm sorry that we ran over time. But, yeah.
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay. On the topic of consciousness being like on the level of the quantum mechanics, what would or I don't really know what I'm asking, but like what would the implication be for mind uploading? Because I'm not sure how it works and how they're trying to do it already. But like if the mind is on a quantum level, how could they possibly incorporate that into some kind of software?
Yes, well, I think it's a great question. It's a very, very profound question. Definitely would make it very difficult because you would have to prepare. It's very difficult to prepare a quantum state because it's so delicate and so subject to environmental fluctuations. I don't know if you so if you think about uploading the mind or the state of mind, whatever you mean by this. Normally, I mean, the brain, we'll talk about this, I think, in the last lecture quite a bit, but of course, we have 100 billion neurons and each neuron can be in a number of states. So that's already a challenge. If you want to upload, if these were quantum bits, not qubits, not actual bits, 0 1s, but these quantum bits, then becomes incredibly difficult to maintain such a complex state. But we still don't know enough about quantum computing to go. I think the most complex quantum computing system right now has 17 qubits or something like that. I don't remember exactly, but it's certainly around 20. So imagine that you have not 20 qubits to upload, but 100 billion qubits if each neuron is in a qubit. So yeah, it's a daunting task, but yeah, who knows what we'll know in 10 years about it. Certainly, quantum computing or quantum mind challenges the notion of artificial intelligence replacing human intelligence, anytime soon. But yeah, that's a great question. I think it could be a very long debate about this discussion. It is where I think our singularity is taking us. When you take the sort of quantum representation for our elementary units of cognitive functioning, I think it's an incredible power. The question is, whether we use all of this and whether all of it is quantum. Maybe it's a hybrid. I keep coming back to this idea that biology is a hybrid structure with some quantum degrees of freedom. Maybe only some of our neurons in different domains may be responsible for creative thinking. I would gather might be in this quantum state. The rest, something like for motor activity, perhaps not. But yeah, even if you just think about creative domains, I don't remember from my neuroscience the names of all these domains, but I know that you can identify them on the map of the brain. They are responsible for different things. Maybe even language, right? I think Noam Chomsky maintains that the language is something that is not algorithmic. I think we are born with some aspects of linguistic capabilities. Maybe that's also in the quantum range of behaviors. I mean,
Okay,
if
well, I think that's maybe a good place to stop. And thank you very, very much.
you don't want to unleash, you don't want to unleash the conversation until midnight, eh?
No, I think the students would resent that, but so would you, because you're 8 hours ahead of us, so.
That's why I mentioned midnight. I'm half an hour to midnight.
Right. Okay, great. So we'll see you all.
See you on Thursday, and yeah, we'll continue.
Sounds good. Okay, thanks.